to Alex for his remarks. And then, as usual, we're going to do questions. So if you can find your yellow hand at the bottom of your screen where reactions are and the little face, I'll try to follow the order in which everybody's asking questions as closely as possible. And always remember who you are and who you work for when you start your question, and keep it as short as possible because there's so many of us today. That's all I'm going to say. Alex, please, if you want to start with your remarks.
Right, thank you so much, Deborah, and President Kate, who's also with us. I understand from Deborah there's 106 subscribers today, so I'll keep my initial remarks as short as possible to allow as many questions as possible. My name is Alex Salmond. I'm the former First Minister of Scotland. I led Scotland into its first independence referendum in 2014. And 3 weeks ago, or just under 3 weeks ago, I helped found a new political party in Scotland called the Alba Party. That's spelled A-L-B-A. It's the Gaelic in Scotland, the ancient language of Scotland. Alba means Scotland. So it's the Gaelic name for Scotland. Indeed, for anyone interested in medieval history, Scotland was actually named the Kingdom of Alba for some 300 years in the early medieval period. So Alba is very well, it means Scotland. And the Alba Party will be contesting the upcoming Scottish elections in 3 weeks' time. So we were founded 3 weeks ago. I was invited to lead the party through the elections. And in 3 weeks' time, we'll have our first electoral test. Now, I'm delighted to say, since launching the party, we've had considerable success. We now have almost 5,000 members, which is more members than, for example, the Scottish Liberal Democrats, who've been around in various disguises for some 150 years. So in 3 weeks, 3 weeks, we've overtaken the Liberals in terms of membership. And I would expect over the next 3 weeks, we'll overtake both the Green Party in Scotland and the Conservative Party, who have about 6,000 members. And we should easily overtake both of these parties as well, which I suspect by the end of this campaign then will be the third largest party in Scotland after the Scottish National Party and the Labour Party. Now, in terms of parliamentary representation, because of people joining us, we now have 2 MPs at Westminster in the Westminster Parliament, which actually is twice as many as the Scottish Labour Party, who've only got 1 MP. And I expect also that by the end of the campaign, we'll have more than 20 elected local councillors across Scotland. So we've had a remarkable 3 weeks in which we've been founded, launched, publicised. We put into the field for the Scottish elections 32 candidates, the length and breadth of Scotland, 18 women, 14 men. Among our candidates are some of the strongest feminist voices in Scottish society. We have the highest ratio of women of any political party contesting the elections, and the quality of our candidates is quite exceptional. So we've brought into being a new political party. We've got 32 candidates in the field standing in the list section of the Scottish Parliament elections, and we expect to mount a strong challenge. We're already registering in the opinion polls, but we know we've got a substantial distance to travel. Our objective in this election is to gain representation, MSPs, in every single one of the 8 regional districts of Scotland. And that is to say, we want to see that representation to be part of what we describe as an independent supermajority. Because with the intervention of Alba, we believe that along with the SNP's constituency strength and that of the Green Party in the list, that Alba can add a significant number of MSPs. And if people so vote, then we could have a situation that we don't have a bare majority of independents supporting MSPs in the Scots Parliament, but that we have 80 or 90 or even more out of a Parliament of 129. We believe that's important because it would be a fundamentally different position from what the Parliament has seen in the past. When I became First Minister for the first time back in 2007, out of these 129 MSPs, there was only 49 who were supporting of independence. when I became First Minister for the second time, we had the barest of majorities of independents supporting MSPs in the Scots Parliament, and that led, of course, to the referendum of 2014. Our contention in Alba is that if we have that supermajority, then it's going to strengthen Scotland's hand overwhelmingly with Boris Johnson and the Tory government of Westminster, because Boris Johnson wants to cast the constitutional debate as party against party, Prime Minister against First Minister, Tory party against SNP. If Alba are successful, gaining that representation in the Scottish elections, being part of that supermajority, then the debate will become, instead of that, Tory Prime Minister against an overwhelming majority of the Scottish Parliament supporting independence, representing the Scottish people. And Tory Prime Minister against the Scottish nation is a fundamentally different equation from seeing it projected as party against party. So on the Constitution, Alba stands for much more urgency than is displayed by the SNP as the government. It's certainly a lot more than by the Scottish Green Party, who are actually pretty weak in their support for independence. We want to see independence established as an immediate priority. We believe that in the first week of the new Scottish Parliament, the Parliament should instruct the Scottish Government to open negotiations with the Westminster Government on the independence project. These negotiations may take some time, of course, but we think the negotiations should be opened immediately, and the case for Scotland should be pursued in that fashion. On other matters, the Alba political programme is coming into place, as you would expect for a party that's 3 weeks old. We've had one policy conference already. We've had another one this coming Saturday, which will give us our manifesto that we take into the elections. Our key priorities beyond independence are: one, economic reconstruction from the global pandemic. We think that the economic programmes on offer from both Westminster and Edinburgh don't meet the scale of the challenge, the scale of the economic tsunami that we face. And therefore, we're bringing forward ideas for a much more radical, fundamental economic programme to confront the pandemic in terms of its economic effects. Thirdly, we think that the independence case, which we took to the electorate in 2014 and narrowly lost, that we have to furnish and burnish it, refurbish it for the new realities of 2021 and beyond. I mean, quite clearly, within a post-pandemic world, Scotland has been now taken out of the European Union against the wishes of the Scottish people. But the independence programme that's presented has to catch up with that reality. We're in a different world from 2014, and the independence programme has to reflect that. And we brought forward, as one of our first policies, a programme on women and inequalities in Scottish society, because the position of women is a part of a major debate in terms of concerns that the hard-won rights of women in Scotland, and particularly the protections of single-sex spaces, for example, are under threat from upcoming legislation. And therefore, our very strong, assertive feminist wing in the party passed a policy which we intend to take through the Scottish elections, which gives, I think, a substantial and positive way forward of how the rights of women, these hard-won rights, can be protected while still looking to respect equality for all, but not jeopardising or sacrificing rights that have already been gained. We have key aspects of education and health policy coming forward, a huge housing programme which we are supporting. We're having a debate on Saturday on a written constitution for Scotland, that we want to see an independent Scotland established like most states in the world with a written constitution, encapsulating the sovereignty of the Scottish people and giving rights and protections for every citizen of our land. And we want that constitution to be ready before independence, not something that we suddenly start to think about after independence. So we've got some deep thinking on the structures of the new Scottish state. So in terms of urgency for independence, of recognising the scale of the economic challenge post-pandemic, of refurbishing the policy, the platform for independence, of key issues of social and economic concern in Scotland and addressing, Alba is providing a fresh, vigorous, new challenge in Scots politics. Now, the last thing I'd say is this, that although it's quite unusual in the UK, which is used to quite a narrow distribution of political parties, many of you in this conference today will be aware that in our Nordic neighbours, when Sweden has 9 political parties represented in the parliament, Norway has 10, Finland has 11, Denmark has about 16 the last time I counted. So only having a few in the Westminster Parliament and only 5 represented in the Scottish Parliament is actually very unusual. In proportional systems in particular, like the one that Scotland has, it's usual to have a variety of parties representing a variety of points of view. And it's going to be entirely helpful to the independence case to have a political party like Alba, not in competition with the SNP on the constituency section, but offering a fresh, vigorous new challenge on the list section of the Scottish ballot, which will give independence supporters the opportunity to vote for independence as an immediate priority, not something for the hereafter, but something for the here and now, something to be taken forward immediately with urgency, with positive determination, which is what Scotland requires at the present moment. So we go into this election campaign with 3 weeks to go, having celebrated tomorrow, I think it is our 3rd anniversary, that is 3 weeks in existence as a political party. So with 3 weeks to go, we go in with high hopes and brave hearts to carry Scotland's case forward. And with that, Deborah, I'm very open indeed to questions.
Thank you very much, Alex. And I will kick off with one, and I've seen all my colleagues, of course, with their hands up, and the ones I have put it in the chat. Also, one thing, please try not to take photographs of Alex Salmond here in this setting. His hair is not done properly, he said before. And so I will put up in the chat the address where you can get proper photographs of him taken the way he wanted them to be taken. Alex, you were saying that you've done quite a lot in 3 weeks, and that is very true. Not just what you've said, but also you've managed to make a few enemies, maybe it's fair to say, in these 3 weeks with the LGBT community, and one of your candidates has had to step down, and there have been some reactions to the video, which you say was tongue-in-cheek, but it does talk about Robert the Bruce breaking the spine of the English oppressor. So what makes you think that should a supermajority be achieved, Boris Johnson will want to talk to Alba?
Well, can I firstly correct you, Deborah? None of our candidates have stepped down. I think you must be referring to other political parties.
I'm referring to Margaret Lynch.
Well, Margaret most certainly hasn't stepped down from anything. Margaret is a valued candidate for us in the West of Scotland list. I mean, I know that many people here don't know Scottish politics, but Margaret's been a foremost campaigner, feminist campaigner in Scotland over the last 30 years. And we are proud to have her as one of our candidates. The controversy at the weekend, I'll deal with this because it has been misreported in some of the mainstream media and therefore needs correction. We had a conference, a women's conference at the weekend, adopting a women and equalities charter, the policy for Alba, and we hope the policy for Scotland, which says many things that need to be saying in Scottish society like that. It was a safe space conference, and deliberately so, because some of the tenor of that debate has been pretty toxic and regrettable. Despite that, there was a tweet made from the conference which inaccurately tweeted a view that Margaret had expressed, quite wrongly, because it was a safe space conference. And despite that, some members of the press corps reported that remark as if it was what Margaret had said. And despite the clarification from Alba as a political party, despite the publication of the policy and the enunciation of it, this misreporting continued. Now, some organisations objected to that, but they were objecting to misreporting and not to anything else. I mean, basically, the concern that had been expressed was an international organisation had expressed some views which about the age of consent in terms of adolescent sexuality. And the concern that was being expressed was that people had to audit and be careful and do due diligence of what they were signing up to internationally. The idea that that's Alex Salmond, as the First Minister who introduced equal marriage in Scotland, that Alba as a political party with some of the strongest feminist voices in the country, including Margaret Lynch, and some prominent gays among our candidates, would have any truck with homophobia is absurd and ridiculous. And it's not the sort of reporting that I know that any of the subscribers to this broadcast would have. Unfortunately, we have some newspapers in Scotland who, instead of reporting what actually happened at the conference, they prefer to report a lot of, basic nonsense. But can I just make it clear that Margaret Lynch is very much part of the Alba campaign, very much one
right, and it was my error, and I apologise. It was Austin Sheridan I was talking about.
No, sorry?
I'm so sorry. I was talking about Austin Sheridan, who quit Alba following the controversy.
I've no idea who Austin Sheridan is. I've never met him. I mean, Alba has 5,000 members. As I understand it, and I only read this from the press, Mr. Sheridan left the SNP to join something called the Alliance for Independence. He then left the Alliance for Independence to join Alba. Now he's left Alba. I mean, Mr. Sheridan has no elected position. He's one of 5,000 Alba members. All I can tell you is that Alba membership is growing every day, and that we have elected councillors and MPs and others in Scottish society. But can I just say what is most disturbing about that particular minor issue that in terms of is the press exaggeration of that online spat is what you would call it, whereas the important issue is the charter, the Women and Equalities Charter that Alba have published. That Alba is the political party which for the first time in many years in Scotland have had a women's conference with huge and valuable contributions from Alba members, indeed from feminist campaigners and other women in Scottish society, publishing a charter which means so much to so many people. And yet some media in Scotland, not the slightest interest in a political policy, all they're interested in some online nonsense and chat. There has been one unfortunate aspect, and I'll just have to mention it, Deborah, and that is that I've been forced as Alba Party leader to report to the police in Scotland some of the bullying and intimidation against our women candidates, including threats of physical violence, from a candidate who's standing for the Green Party in Scotland, threatening to, and I won't say the expression because it's, but threatening physical violence to our women campaigners. The serious intimidation online that Alba women have been subjected to. Now that's an important issue and one that will be dealt with by the authorities. And the other important issue is to welcome and celebrate the Charter for women's rights, for the Women and Inequalities policy, which is going to mean so much to hundreds of thousands of women in Scotland and articulate views that need to be said in Scottish society at present. Well, that's what matters. But listen, you raised the point that you were diverted, but you're absolutely quite right to say we've been 3 weeks in as a political party. Yes, we have enemies, of course, but in politics, I mean, you only get kicked if you're worth kicking. We have certainly stirred up some controversy. Maybe that's not a bad thing in a political campaign. And so lastly, Deborah, since you quite rightly say there was controversy about one of our campaign videos, your campaign video, which we'll make available to everybody at the conference here, had Angus McFadden, who many of you remember played Robert the Bruce, Scotland's hero king in Braveheart the movie, and reprised that role in a movie which he co-wrote just last year called The Bruce. He's now incidentally playing Jor-El in a new television series just launched, the Superman's Dad. So we've now got Superman's dad arguing for a supermajority in Scottish politics. But Angus McFadden made a very thematic video where he contrasted the small folk, the camp followers, the ordinary people of Scotland who were decisive in the Battle of Bannockburn of 1314 in showing the English army led Edward II. They believed that there was a second Scottish army had emerged And what actually had emerged was the small folk, the camp followers, on from a hill. And Angus, in a very lovely video, compared that to the popular sovereignty, the demonstrations taking place in Scottish society, peaceful democratic demonstrations of hundreds of thousands of people, and made the point that this election, and indeed the future of Scotland, will again be decided by the small folk. The video was tongue-in-cheek. Like many people around the world, the best of Scots like to have a laugh at ourselves. Unfortunately, some of our media are pretty po-faced, but the serious political point was made in the video, that Scotland has always believed in popular sovereignty, and the mobilisation of people power is one of the most important ways in peaceful, respectful, but determined demonstration. Is one of the tactics that we're going to require, I strongly suspect, if we're going to face down Boris Johnson and the English Conservative government who want to deny Scottish democracy.
Thank you very much. We'll start with President Kate, the first question. Then I've got an order. Antonello, I saw you, Pilar, Carlos, Anna Marie, and we'll carry on.
Thank you, Deborah. Alex, thank you again on behalf of all of us for giving us your time today. It's really, as you can see, a huge amount of interest. On the question of independence, which is clearly important to you, can you understand people's concerns about your independence when you're associated with Russia Today, which as a broadcaster is not like working for the BBC or another? They're considered to have a lot of underhanded influence with the people that work for them. What are your thoughts on that?
I host a television program which is produced by Slange Media, spelled Slainte. It's another Gaelic word. It means good health in Gaelic. And Slange Media independently produced a program which is then broadcast on RT. Originally, incidentally, it was meant to be an ITV series, but the RT platform broadcasts a program which is independently produced. But I can say after doing it for 3 years that I haven't had a single suggestion given to me by anyone in RT as to what should and shouldn't be in the programme. We are perfectly free to cover any subject we wish. Our concentration is on Scottish, UK and European politics, but we can roam far and wide and have done. But the main concentration is politics of Western Europe. And nobody in RT has made even a suggestion as to what we should put in the programme. So all I can say from my experience, if you independently produce a programme which is then shown in RT, then, well, on my experience, I've got no doubts that there's been no attempt at editorial interference of any kind whatsoever. Incidentally, I know well some BBC journalists, and she mentioned the BBC, and I think they would give their eye teeth to be in a position where there's not some overweening editorial suggestions made to people who produce programmes for the BBC. In my experience, and it's only my experience, if you produce an independent programme as Slange Media does, then no one from RT tries to interfere in any way, shape or form with what you broadcast. And we've had no difficulty bringing to the screen some excellent guests who are prepared to speak and have their views reported on that basis. So I can give you my experience and my experience alone.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Antonello Guerrera from La Repubblica, Italy.
Hello, Mr. Salmond. Thank you very much for this. Antonello Guerrera from La Repubblica, as Deborah said. I have two quick questions. The first one is, can you please explain to the non-British audience the 2 or 3 main bullet points of your idea of independence, in which ones differs from the one of SNP and Nicola Sturgeon? Like, in case of independence, you are going to immediately trigger a process to join the EU. And secondly, can you please tell us politically, and also if you want personally speaking, the best quality and the worst quality of Nicola Sturgeon? Thank you.
Surely. I would say the main difference, and remember, Alba's policy programme is just coming to being of necessity because we've only been in business for 3 weeks. But the main difference is one of timescale. And Nicola's suggestions recently is that an independence referendum might take place after 2023, as she says, after the pandemic is over. Even the Green Party, incidentally, who are the other pro-independence party, are talking about any time up to 2026. So the main difference is one of timescale. We think that Scottish Parliament, with hopefully that independent supermajority, should initiate discussions, negotiations with the Westminster government in week 1 of the new Parliament. That is to say, in 1 month's time. Now, of course, the Westminster government may decline to take part in negotiations. They may say, no, we're not bothered about 90 or even more MSPs in the Scottish Parliament being a part of an independent supermajority. We're going to continue on our merry way and continue to defy Scottish democracy. I think there's a much less chance of that happening with the supermajority, with Boris Johnson confronting not a single political party in the SNP, but an entire parliament representing an entire nation. But obviously, if that does happen, then Alba will support a range of tactics, including the organisation of potentially a plebiscite organised by the Scottish Parliament, including, for example, domestic legal action through the Court of Session, in terms of underlining the rights and privileges of the Scottish Parliament and the underlying sovereignty of the people, which was actually the subject of Agnes McFadden's video, incidentally. There could be international legal action. I mean, many of you would look askance at a situation where Scotland is an ancient European nation, if indeed it does elect a vast majority of members of Parliament wishing to push forward for independence, that a Westminster Tory government, which is a minority opinion in Scotland, says no to that democratic wish. So the international courts might be extremely interested, particularly when Scotland's position is established within the United Kingdom by an international treaty. And no one previously, and certainly no British Prime Minister since Harold Wilson, has doubted the right of the Scottish nation to self-determination as a nation. So the international courts may be an avenue for us. We may look at peaceful demonstrations in Scottish society, because the mobilisation of people power is going to be extremely important in carrying forward this democratic political struggle. So these are all areas which I'll have to move into, but the most important decisive step is to initiate negotiations for Scottish independence in week 1 of a parliament, not waiting to 2023, not waiting to 2026, but to treat independence with the urgency that it requires and deserves. In terms of Nicola's strengths, I would say her communication skills are exceptional. Nicola is a first-rate politician, and these communication skills have been evident. If you compare Nicola Sturgeon and Boris Johnson during the course of the pandemic, then the policy programme of how to cope with the coronavirus have been roughly the same in Scotland as in the UK. And the results have been comparable as well. I mean, you would say that neither Scotland nor the UK in international terms has dealt well with the virus and the pandemic, but both Scotland and the UK have had a very strong record on the vaccination programme in comparison with other countries. But the policy programmes have been similar, but it's been certainly much better expressed in Scotland through Nicola Sturgeon's communication skills than it has in the UK through Boris Johnson, who struggles to, in many ways, to put forward a rational argument that people believe or understand. So I say her communication skills are great strength. In terms of weakness, I think she's she's too timid on the independence question. I think, if we go back to 2014, then there's an argument that in many ways in the run-up to 2014, the politicians, my leadership, the SNP, the Scottish Parliament at that time, were in advance of popular opinion in terms of progressing the independence case. In 2021, there's a severe danger that the politicians are behind popular opinion, that they are the leaders but following the people reluctantly at a period of time. So the caution on independence, I think, would be something that certainly people will judge in this election, whether they think Alba has a role in injecting more urgency into the independence question.
And will you, in case of an independent Scotland, will you like to join the EU?
Well, we have a discussion at our second policy conference this coming Saturday, when a paper is being presented in Scotland and the world. So if I may, I would like to leave it to that conference, but to give you an outline, that paper argues that there has to be, just as there has to be urgency on the independence question, there has to be urgency about reconnecting Scotland immediately with our European marketplace. I mean, Scotland is an ancient European nation. Since we've been dealing with Scottish history, I'll do a wee story from Scottish history as quickly as I can. Way back in the Middle Ages, before even Robert the Bruce, some years before, William Wallace, the great Scottish hero, won a fantastic victory at Stirling Bridge and got to Scotland into a position of initiative in terms of the independence struggle. The first thing he did after that battle with Andrew de Murray, who was his co-commander, was not to have some great celebration. They wrote a joint letter to the Hanseatic League. As many of you know, the trading connections across the Baltic, across Europe. So within days of that battle, they wrote a letter to the Hanseatic League, which I paraphrased in the Latin, said, look, things have changed in Scotland, we're back in business. We want to re-establish our trading privileges with the rest of Europe and our concessions, and can we please get back in? And he wrote the letter to Lubeck, which then that time was one of the centres of the Hanseatic League. Now, again, it's a historical analogy, but we are back in that position. We've been shut out of effective access to the European marketplace because of Boris Johnson's crazy Brexit proposals. And we have to re-establish that position. Let's get right to the current day. As a Member of Parliament for many years at Westminster, I represented the greatest fishing constituency in Europe in Bath and Button, the ports of Peterhead and Fraser. And I was proud to do so. And I loved my fishing constituents and still do. These constituents were tempted by the Brexit message because they were told, look, you get out of Europe, you get out the common fisheries policy, and everything will be much, much better. In reality, of course, what has happened over the last few months is that they've been shut out of European markets. So the highest value fish, the Scottish langoustines, which I'm sure all of you, which we took 20 years to build up the marketplace for, it's been sacrificed. And with that has been sacrificed the livelihoods of Scottish fishermen. And just yesterday, one of the most influential voices in the industry, the longest serving skipper in the entire Scottish fleet, a chap called John Buchan of the Fairline, Peterhead boat, he released a video supporting the Alba Party. And John said, look, during the Brexit referendum, you couldn't move in the Peterhead marketplace without Boris Johnson and Michael Gove or Nigel Farage being there and coming up to tell us what we should do. Now you can't see them because they're not in existence. They're nowhere to be seen. And he did suggest to the Prime Minister, and this is John Buchan's words, that if he ever comes back to Peterhead, then Boris Johnson better learn to swim, because he won't just be visiting the harbour, he's likely to end up in the harbour. So betrayed do the fishing communities of Scotland feel by the Brexiteers. So the urgency is to re-establish our position within the single marketplace as quickly as possible. This is not something that can wait. Entire industries in Scotland are being sacrificed on the altar of Brexit. So that is coming to our policy conference on Saturday. If you interview me again on Monday, I'll be able to tell you what the result is.
We will, Alex, if you invite us to do so. We have so many questions, guys, so please just keep it to one and be as brief as possible. Pilar, if you'd like to unmute yourself and go for it.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Mr. Salmond. In 2014, sorry, in 2014, London promised the Scots that Holyrood would become the most powerful parliament, devolved parliament in the world. And with Brexit, London has grabbed the powers coming back to Scotland from Europe. Fisheries is one of these powers, and introduced the internal market bill. And now we have learned that the UK government is challenging Scottish legislation approved unanimously by Holyrood in the Supreme Court. It seems like Westminster is trying to weaken Holyrood to the point of irrelevance. and even intend to bypass it with funding going directly to regional councils. You have said that Alba is not a government party. So my question is, what do Alba propose to stop this lack of respect and attacks for Scottish institutions?
Pilar, good morning. And your question is well informed, as you always are. What Pilar is referring to is in the final days of the 2014 referendum, when the Yes campaign took the lead in the opinion polls, after starting about 30 points behind, the final days of the campaign on opinion polls, the Yes campaign took the lead. And there was mass panic in the Westminster parties. And they signed something that is the then leaders of the Westminster parties, that was David Cameron, Nick Clegg, and Ed Miliband. I was just trying to remember who it was leader for the Labour Party. They signed something called the Pledge, the Vow, as it was called. And this was presented by one of the unionist newspapers in Scotland, the Daily Record, a tabloid paper. It was a good piece of presentation and journalism, and unfortunately many people took it at its word. The vow said, as Pilar rightly said, if Scotland votes against independence, then there'll be the most powerful parliament in Europe, of any region across Europe, and there'll be more powers given to the parliament, and you don't need independence because you'll get all the powers you want given to you by Westminster. And of course, as soon as people voted no, narrowly, but still voted no, and the pressure came off, Westminster didn't just not implement the vow, they tore up the vow, the very even scant pretense of it being implemented. They implemented it something at Westminster which excluded Scots MPs from voting on a whole variety of matters. So they were actually restricting the rights of Scottish MPs. And now, 7 years later, they're intent on restricting the rights of the Scottish Parliament. So when the Brexiteers told us that once we got out of Europe, there'd be lots more powers that could be distributed to the Scottish Parliament, what they actually meant is the powers from Europe, the regional assistance powers, for example, the investment, the capital investment programs, which incidentally have served Scotland very well because by and large, the European Commission was sympathetic to parts of Scotland, like the west of Scotland with the industrial reconstruction, the Highlands and Islands of Scotland with all the difficulties of rural connectivity, and we did very well out of these programs. Instead of these being given to the Scottish Parliament to implement now, they've been taken by Westminster. They're going to be implemented from London, as if it was some sort of noblesse oblige. They're going to take Scotland's money and then give some of it back in capital grants. And I suspect, and I know, that we'll get a much worse deal from Westminster than we did from Europe. So Pilar's quite right when she says, instead of giving more powers, which is what the vow said they would do if Scotland voted no, what we've got is the political reality that Westminster's intended to take powers away from the Parliament. As to what to do about it, quite rightly, we don't want in Alba to be a governing party. We see ourselves as an opposition party, a constructive opposition, one that says we should have urgency in social and economic questions and urgency on the constitutional question in Scotland. But I believe and know, in fact, that the way to stop Westminster demeaning the powers of the Scottish Parliament is to insist on urgency in the constitutional question. Because once we say in the first week that Scotland wants to move forward for independence, then I absolutely promise you that just like the vow in 2014, Boris Johnson and the rest of the Westminster parties will be scrambling to say how much more power they're going to give to the Scottish Parliament instead of the current position, which is to take it away. So Scotland, in order to maintain and strengthen its position, needs to show that it's serious about the move to independence.
Thank you. Carlos, if you'd like to go with your question.
Hi, Alex. Thank you very much. You've been always so attentive to the international media. Thank you very much for this occasion. I want to make you just one simple question. If London says no to a new referendum, would we end up in a situation as the one we had in Catalonia with the risk of violence in the streets?
Hey, thank you very much, Carlos. I should apologise to everybody. I've got a small chest infection, which is causing me some trouble. It's on the mend, I'm pleased to say. But I've been speaking a lot over the last 3 weeks, as you'll understand. Carlos, I don't think the comparison with Catalonia is entirely accurate for a number of reasons. And it's, incidentally, my observation was that Catalonia didn't engage in violence. Violence was done unto the people of Catalonia. Mm. But there is differences between the Catalonian and the Scottish situation. Rightly or wrongly, the Spanish constitution does not prohibit the secession of any region of Spain. Many people would say that's the wrong thing, and an ancient nation like Catalonia should have the right of self-determination. I would say that. But that is the situation in Spain, in the Spanish constitution. That, of course, is not the situation with the unwritten British constitution. On the contrary, every single prime minister from Harold Wilson onwards, Harold Wilson, the Labour prime minister of the 1960s, a great hero of mine, incidentally, but every prime minister has said absolutely that Scotland, the Scottish people, the Scottish nation, a nation went freely into a Treaty of Union in 1707, but has always been accepted that Scotland has the right to vote itself into independence if it so chooses, and that is perfectly compatible with the unwritten British constitution. I mean, if we take, for example, one of the greatest opponents of Scottish self-government in history, one of the most powerful prime ministers in Scottish history, the British history, I disagreed with her incidentally just about everything, but she was a powerful, powerful lady, and that is Margaret Thatcher. When she was prime minister, and I think I quote her exactly from the Downing Street Years, her autobiography, she said that she had striven against Scottish independence for all of her political life. She believed in the Union, absolutely. But she said, if the Scots, as an ancient nation, were to determine on independence, then no English politician, certainly not myself, would gainsay that process. So even the foremost opponents of Scottish independence through history recognized the right of Scotland as a nation within the context of the unwritten British constitution to determine on independence if we so choose. So therefore, I think you'll find that the opposition of Boris Johnson, if we cast it, and this is a big if, firstly, if we vote for the independence supermajority, if we put 90 MSPs or so in the Scots Parliament supporting independence, if we cast the argument not as party against party, SNP against Tories, but if it's Boris Johnson against Scotland, then the Prime Minister will cave in politically. Because two things, and lastly, Carlos, is that one, just about everybody in Scotland, 90% or more, whether they believe in independence or not, accepts the idea that Scotland has a right to be independent if it chooses to be independent. But even more importantly, a substantial majority of the people of England, as opposed to the politicians at Westminster, the people of England believe the same thing. They may regret Scotland wishing to be independent. They may not think it's a good idea. They may think the Union is a good idea. But if you ask the people of England, it has been done in a number of surveys, do you think Scotland has the right to be independent? The answer is yes. And that is because the people of England, unlike many of the politicians, are fair-minded, democratic, decent people.
Thank you. Anna-Marie, if you'd like to go. Anna-Marie Sipilä from Helsingin Sanomat, Finland.
Hello, Mr. Salmond. You mentioned several Nordic countries. I was wondering, do you see the independent Scotland as one of the Nordic countries? And for example, you think that Scotland in the future should join the Nordic Council?
Well, again, I have to paraphrase this by saying that Alba will be discussing that among other aspects at the weekend. But a personal opinion, yes, I do. I think we have much in common with our Nordic neighbours. I think in social and economic terms, but also in terms of the arc of economic prosperity across the Nordic countries is very important. The point I was making about the Nordic countries actually was much more that because they have proportional systems by and large, they have many more political parties than we've been used to in Scotland and the UK because of the first past the post system. And of course, you know, it's not the Nordic countries without a step, it's the UK with its arcane political system. And Scotland has taken a bit of time to catch up. We have a proportional system. But 20 years into the reconvening of our parliament, we're only now catching up with the possibilities that that proportional system offers for a range of political viewpoints to be represented in the parliament. And the gap in the market right now is for a political party which perhaps gives more opposition to the present SNP government in social and economic policy, that questions whether the government is doing enough to reconstruct the Scottish economy and to ensure our economic success, and whether some of the social measures being taken by the Scottish government, I'm thinking of the hate crime bill, which would seem to curb key elements of freedom of speech, whether legislation like that is supported by the Scottish population. So more opposition and social economic, but much more support and urgency for the Scottish government in pursuing the independence agenda. The unionist parties in Scotland, such as they are, the Labour, Tory, Liberal Democrats, a motley coalition, they are powder puff, hopeless, useless in their opposition in what they should be doing, and they're bringing forward alternative economic and social policies. So totally rubbish at it. They spend the entire time gunning and whining and moaning and obstructing this SNP in terms of the independence policy. What I believe is needed in the Scottish Parliament is an opposition which will be supportive of giving urgency to independence and get right behind the government, and indeed advocating faster progress and independence, but provide a much more rigorous examination of the government's economic and social record. Last small point there. When I was First Minister back in 2007, I led a minority government. We had a plurality. We were the biggest party, but there were vastly more MPs of a unionist persuasion. And we had every day we could be outvoted in the Parliament. And that made for better government. We were on our toes all the time. We were constantly on the lookout, on the watch, to make sure that we weren't vulnerable in any social or economic issue. And we achieved much more in that situation than perhaps a government with a comfortable majority does, and weak opposition, which they have at the present moment. So, Alba, if we're elected, and that depends entirely on the Scottish people, and forming and leading a political party in a 6-week period is quite a business, believe me. But if we are elected, and if we do gain representation, then you'll see much more vigorous opposition on social economic issues, and much more supportive urging of the government to get on with the independence negotiations and get on with the independence question.
Thank you, Alex. And from Finland, we go to Denmark. Bjarne Norum from Kristelig Dagblad. Sorry for the pronunciation, I'm sure it's wrong.
Madain Mahat, Alex. I hope that was correct.
Very good. Very good indeed.
It was Gaelic for good morning for the rest of you. So you have name-checked the Scandinavian countries for the PR system. But when you go in this election with Alba, and you only go for those seats that are in the PR system and not the single constituencies, can you not argue that you're only joining this election half-hearted rather than brave-hearted?
That's a very, very good question, very clever question. I don't think so. I think, if you decide and agree to lead a political party 6 weeks out from an election, if you're part of the launch and formation of that political party and getting into its policy agenda, this array of extraordinary candidates and the rest of it, I think you could be called many things. You could be called foolhardy, to say the least. But I don't think you can be accused of being faint-hearted. So I think Alba goes forward with brave hearts and high hopes into this election campaign. But I see your point about the proportional system. The reason we're not contesting the constituencies is we don't want to be in competition with the SNP at constituency level, because we want the SNP to win the constituencies. In fact, we're openly saying, I'll be voting SNP in the constituency ballot in East Aberdeenshire and Aberdeenshire East, where I stay. But we're saying vote Alba on the list. And we're saying for example, in the last election in Scotland, the SNP got 1 million votes, almost 1 million votes on the list, on the regional list, and elected only 4 MSPs, I beg your pardon, from that list. In the northeast of Scotland, where I stay, 137,000 people voted the SNP on the list in 2016 and got nothing. Not a single MSP elected from the list. If half of these people were to vote Alba in this election on the regional list, then all 4 of the Alba candidates from the northeast of Scotland would be returned. And the same thing would happen in the other 8 regions of Scotland, and Alba would have well, not just a taxi full of MSPs, but a barrel load of MSPs. We'd need a bus to take the Alba contingent to the Scottish Parliament. So that is the potential, that's the opportunity that beckons for Scotland in this election. But I think in launching, leading a political party into an election campaign at 6 weeks' notice, I could be accused of being many things, but faint-hearted is not one of them. So it's brave hearts from Alba.
Thank you, Alex, and Benedict, if you want to go for it.
Yeah. Hello, Mr. Salmond, France 24 in French and English. Why did you launch Alba so late? And what if instead of helping to build a supermajority for independence at Holyrood, you do the exact opposite?
Well, late because the number of parties had come forward looking at the same opportunity. There was the Independence for Scotland Party, the Alliance for Independence, there was a party called Scotia's Futures, there was the Scottish Independence Referendum Party, and all of these people asked me if I would come forward and be part of their programme. But the one that impressed me most was Alba. And that was launched by and formed by a journalist, a former World in Action journalist called Laurie Flynn. And Laurie and his committee came to me some months ago and said, look, this is the political party that we've registered. This is the potential programme, a social democratic party with an understanding of Scotland's position as a European nation, who want to drive forward the surge for economic success, promoting social equality and environmental responsibility. And with a hugely democratic one-member, one-vote constitution, which we'll take forward, and this is the priorities that we have, and this is where we see the gap in the market. And I think we said, look, we want to see a political party which is much more vigorous in its critique of the SNP in social and economic matters, and much more vigorous in its pursuit of Scottish independence. And that was the one that appealed to me. So, I was a late comer because I was invited, and I was invited to lead the party through the election campaign, which I've agreed to do. The people will judge whether that is going to be a success or not. That's in the hands of the people. As for your second part, no, that won't happen. The SNP will win a majority on the constituency section if they pay attention to what they should do in an election campaign, and if they avoid complacency, and if they don't get drawn into some of the unionist nonsense, then they'll win an overwhelming majority of this constituency section. And I think they should, because they stand for independence. Alba will make a breakthrough on the regional list section. The importance of Alba, as opposed to the Green Party, lies in the independence question. I mean, I think the SNP are too timid on independence, but the Green Party are even more timid. I mean, for example, when I became First Minister back in 2007, I got the great help of the 2 Green representatives who were in that Parliament. And that was crucial, actually, in getting me elected as First Minister. And they gave us a confidence and supply arrangement with the 2 MSPs. And that was good because, obviously my pursuit of renewable politics in Scotland, making Scotland self-sufficient in renewable energy and powering much, much more. I mean, that was part of my essential political programme, and I got the solid support of the Green representatives in pursuing that. It was controversial then, incidentally, much less controversial now. But these Green Party politicians, the 2 of them, one was for independence and one was against independence. A lovely MSP called Robin Harper, a wonderful guy, wonderful Green politician, but just against independence. So the Green Party don't have it as part of their fibre of being. It's not part of the essence of Green policy for independence. They are weaker on independence than the SNP is. And Alba believe we should be stronger on independence. And that's why I think Alba will gain on the list. We will build that supermajority. And instead of the present moment of the being a bare majority of SNP and Greens in the current Parliament, which hasn't progressed the independence question incidentally, we'll have a supermajority which Alba will make a contribution to. And that supermajority will be in a much better position to advance the independence cause. But listen, like everything else, It's in the hands of the people. The people will.
Thank you very much. Gregorio Sorgi from Il Foglio, Italy. Please unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks, Deborah. No, I'll be very quick and to the point. Would you have joined Alba if there hadn't been the court case and the judicial review, which many have described as a conspiracy by the SNP? And what do you respond to critics who say that this political operation is a vendetta towards the Prime Minister, the First Minister? Thanks.
Well, on the last, I mean, that's stuff and nonsense. Obviously, I had to, but for those who don't know, there were two court cases, a civil court case and a criminal case, and a number of parliamentary investigations. All of these, I won, and in the civil case, the government's actions were described by the Court of Session, the highest civil court in Scotland, as being unlawful, unfair, and tainted by apparent bias. And there will be a continuing legal action in order to hold those in the government and the civil service to account, whose conduct has been examined by a parliamentary committee and found to be wanting. So there'll be a continuing civil case. In the criminal case, I was cleared of all charges by a jury. Now, most fair-minded people say, once the jury has decided, that's over. But obviously, the parliamentary inquiries ran on for a year, even though the inquiries were into the conduct of the government. And that's what they were about. So these inquiries had to come to a conclusion before I could re-enter public life. So that also dictated the timescale. Now, in terms of personal disagreements, personal disagreements are inevitable in politics. They happen from time to time. That's what happens. But we're not talking here about personal stuff. We're talking here about national stuff. This is about the Scottish nation. And the national is much, much more important than the personal. And for me, and I suspect for Nicola Sturgeon as well. So, Nicola in the campaign says, well, she won't be lifting the phone after the election to consult with me. Well, fair enough, but I'll lift the phone to her. Obviously, I wouldn't have to lift the phone. We'll hopefully be in the same parliament together. And on day one, as we look for a first week initiative on opening negotiations, I'll be contacting the First Minister and giving her and Alba's full support in driving forward the independence question, but also asking for more urgency. Let's get on with this. We cannot continue in Scottish society with votes for independence not being respected by Westminster, but more importantly, not an initiative in the Scottish Parliament to take them forward. We're never going to get an answer to this question until we ask it. And I think we should ask the question. In terms of, just referring back to the Braveheart, Faintheart question, which tickled me greatly, I thought it was very good. When we kicked off the independence referendum, the first one in 2012, through the Edinburgh Agreement, which I signed with David Cameron, the support for Scottish independence was, I think, 30%, roughly 30%. And support against Scottish independence was 70%. There was a 40% majority for the union in the opinion polls, but we still kicked off the independence referendum. And during that referendum campaign, the support for independence increased by 15%, the support for the union declined. Now we're in a position where, I think 30 out of the last 34 polls have shown a majority for independence. But certainly we're no worse than 50-50. We're like 40 points better than we were in 2012. So I don't see the reason, if I as First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon as my deputy, were willing to force forward the independence question in 2012 when independence was at 30%, why on earth wouldn't we be doing that now when independence is at 50%? Whatever the starting point for Scottish independence is before a referendum campaign or another test of opinion, trust me, support will increase through the campaign as more and more people hear and understand the arguments for Scotland being an independent nation, the natural state of the nation, and indeed the vast majority of people in this conference will be representing journals or broadcasting organisations which are part of independent nation states. So it's a natural course of the nation to be an independent self-governing. It's unnatural, unusual to be part of a supranational state like the United Kingdom.
Thank you. I'm really conscious of time. We're running over just a few minutes, but if you have
That's
the
all
time
right.
to stay with us,
Of course.
just an extra few minutes, I'd like to go to Tessa Sieskovic from Profil Austria. Tessa, please.
Yeah, hi, Mr. Salmond. A quick question on European response. Do you think it would be helpful or harmful if European governments would say, like, okay, guys, vote for independence because we won't let you hanging. We'll try to get you into the European Union as soon as possible as the 28th member state?
I think that would be helpful. I look, there is, any way you look at this, there are obligations and negotiations that you have to have. Scotland has not been in the position in 2014, as you remember. I argued, look, the transition of Scotland from being a region of the UK to an independent state within the European Union is seamless. Nobody's going to seriously suggest you've got to go out of the European Union to get back in it. That's a ridiculous position put forward by the unionist parties. And of course, in terms of statecraft, that would never have happened. Now we're in a different position. We are outside the European Union. And of course, there's huge sympathy for Scotland from Austria and from elsewhere. Many states who sympathise with the Scottish predicament of being pro-European but excluded from the European family. And of course, there's much less support for Westminster. I mean, Westminster back in 2014, particularly through the offices of Mr. Barroso, but Westminster had much more clout in Europe because it was a big member state. Now Westminster are out of Europe, and there's precious little sympathy for London politics and the rest of the European Union. But even so, you would have a situation where you'd have to apply for membership, and that membership would be granted over a period of time. I think great sympathy, great wish to accelerate the negotiations, of course there would be, but they would take some time. Now, one of the points we'll be making in Alba this weekend is, yes, okay, the politics take time, but the economics can't wait. So whatever the position in terms of the timescale of the politics, Scotland has to get back into the European marketplace, back into the European economic area as quickly as possible. Now, fortunately, as you're well aware, there are ways to do that before you have full European Union membership. There are ways to get into the European marketplace. And of course, there are a number of countries which are part of the European internal marketplace, the European economic area, which are not members of the European Union. So whatever Scotland's future destination and whatever time it takes to establish that destination, there are immediate things that require to be done. These fishermen I spoke about earlier on, and who I feel for so deeply because I represented them for so many years, they can't wait for political negotiations. Their crisis is now. They can't get their product into the European marketplace. They need help. They need an immediate agenda which says, let's get Scotland back into that marketplace so that all of you can enjoy Scottish langoustines as the best shellfish in the world, I believe.
We're all based here, so we're still enjoying them. Sorry, well, Alex, I don't want to rush you, but we've got 4 more questions. And Tessa, I hope that answered your question so that I can move on to Paul Waldy. And thank you so much for the others who've been so patient waiting. We'll get Paul and then 3 more.
Hi there, thanks for taking my question. Just 2 quick questions, if I could. You mentioned having your own plebiscite in Scotland, and I wonder what that would achieve if it wasn't legally binding. Wouldn't that just be divisive and as one of my colleagues talked about, kind of a Catalonia-esque type of situation? And secondly, how do you answer, because I've heard Nicola Sturgeon, and I think Nicola Sturgeon's actually ruled that out as well, having your own referendum, but how do you answer Boris Johnson's retort constantly that the 2014 referendum was the once-in-a-generation referendum, and you just can't keep having referendums over and over again?
Well, on the second question, of course, as you're probably familiar with, let's have a look at the Northern Ireland situation and the Belfast Agreement, St Andrews Agreement, actually, first. You'll find that constitutional referendum approved by the Cabinet Office of the UK is allowable every 7 years, according to that agreement. So the Cabinet Office of the United Kingdom signed an agreement to establish peace in Northern Ireland, which said that constitutional border poll, as it's called in Ireland, could be held every 7 years. That was the definition used by the Cabinet Office. That seems to me a pretty reasonable definition. How many years is it since the last Scottish referendum? Oh my goodness, it's 7 years. So I think that's a reasonable timescale. And secondly, and this is the really important point, it isn't for Boris Johnson or Alex Salmond or Nicola Sturgeon or anyone to determine when Scotland has a referendum or when it decides to vote itself to independence. It's for the Scottish people to determine. And if the Scottish people as a nation say, look, we want a referendum, we want independence, we want an electoral test to vote ourselves constitutionally into independence, then they have the right to do it. And thirdly, of course, one of the contrasts between, again, Scotland and Catalonia, Scotland has its own legal system, as you're well aware, and any aspect of legality of a referendum would go to the Court of Session in the first instance, the highest civil court in Scotland. Don't confuse the question of a plebiscite being illegal. What is legal and unlawful is determined by the Court of Session, and the Court of Session would determine such a thing. Lastly, and very lastly, I'm aware of time, I negotiated the Section 30 referendum. I did that, extracted it from David Cameron. I can honestly tell you, David Cameron did not look at the result of the 2011 election and say, jolly good show, Alec, well done, we'll grant you a Section 30 referendum. He had to be persuaded to do so. Similarly, Boris Johnson has to be persuaded to do so. Basically, if a determination and political effort can turn David Cameron on the issue, they can certainly turn Boris Johnson on the issue, but you have to make the effort and the initiative.
Thank you. Kim Aranda from Cat newspaper. If you want to unmute yourself, Kim, thank you for waiting. And then we've got Daniel, and then we're done.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Deborah, and thank you, Mr. Salmond, for the press conference. I would like to ask two questions. In the case of an independentist majority, I'm wondering if you will call for a new referendum without Westminster authorization if eventually Boris Johnson does not allow. And then I'm wondering also if the Scotland case to re-entering the EU will not be much more difficult because of another land border between the UK and the European Union.
Very good questions indeed. I will just repeat that there are a number. Firstly, you open negotiations. So a parliament, I think a supermajority has an infinitely better chance of progressing this than a narrow majority. I think a number of parties representing a parliament and a country have a much better chance of progressing it than a single political party. That changes the power balance between Scotland and Westminster. But let's just say that Boris Johnson is obdurate. He has to be persuaded, as David Cameron once had to be persuaded. Then, of course, you employ a range of tactics. One of these tactics is a plebiscite or a legalising a consultation exercise through the courts of Scotland. Another tactic is to have domestic legal action to enforce Scotland's rights, international legal action to say to the international community, look, we're a parliament of 129 people, 90 of us believe in independence. By any democratic standard across the world, our rights should be recognised. And international courts might be very favourable to a position advocated by the Scottish Parliament to that effect. Then, of course, it's the question of people power, popular demonstration. Now, look, I've got some complaints with the BBC, mainly that they don't cover the Alba Party, or indeed the cause of Scottish nationalism fairly. The intervention in the last referendum was a total disgrace against everything the BBC has ever stood for. But the BBC regularly, often, on a weekly basis, favourably covers people power, peaceful demonstrations elsewhere across the world, and says that shows the power of the people. And I'm sure they'll give proper, due, fair-minded coverage to people power demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations, when the COVID regulations allow in Scottish society. The people power is an important part of a political process, part of a democratic process. The key thing for a Scots Parliament is to establish the legitimacy of our cause and to broadcast that to Scottish opinion, to the Westminster Parliament, and to international opinion. Some folk, lastly, some folk ask you, why am I bothering with this press conference today? Why haven't I, getting around Scotland and, spending my time on the Scottish press? Well, the reason is because international opinion is hugely important. It's part of the independence process. Scotland has to establish the legitimacy of the independence cause, not just to a domestic audience, but to an international audience. And of course, as you're well aware, Scotland has many friends around Europe and around the world. That is a strength of Scotland's position.
Thank you. And directly from the Swedish radio's Ferrari, here's Daniel Alling. If you want to go ahead. I'm afraid we can't hear you, even if you are unmuted.
Deborah, could you interpret the question? Are you not hearing either? No?
I'm lip reading. I'm lip reading. Try again, Daniel. It's not working. I am so sorry. It's really not working. Do you want to write it down? I actually forgot while he's sorting it out. Alex, I forgot to ask you a question from Televisa Mexico, whose microphone also wasn't working.
Let's do that.
I don't know if you saw it on the chat. It was asking, do you think, as President Biden does, that Mr. Putin is a killer?
Well, what I'd say is President Biden, I saw his statement yesterday saying he wanted a much more regular relationship, a stable relationship with Russia. And I think all of us incidentally should welcome that. One of the beneficial things about the political demise of President Trump is that perhaps name calling in politics will diminish, and proper, mature, grown up diplomacy between the superpowers and between all countries, which has been missing for so long, will be reintroduced. And therefore, I took great heart from President Biden's comments yesterday. I do hope that America will reassume its leadership role in international diplomacy. That American diplomacy will start to be consistent, experienced, welcoming, instead of erratic and strange as it's been for a number of years. I think Joe Biden, whatever else might be said, well, two things I'll say about Joe Biden. One is that he's experienced, and that experience hopefully will shine through in how he handles international relationships. And secondly, Joe Biden famously is a friend of Ireland, as he has said himself. I hope he is a friend of Scotland as well.
Thank you. And I got Daniel Alling's questions for you, Swedish radio. So the first one is, do you see the similarities between your arguments for independence and the Brexiteers' arguments for independence? And the second one, as a follow-up, is, should you not be happy for Brexit? Because without it, you wouldn't have had a case for a second referendum.
I'll take the second bit first. I'll take the first. I think the politics, the social democratic politics of Scotland and the politics of the Alba Party are rather different from the politics of Brexiteers. If you like, Brexiteerism, whatever else you might think about, hark back to some sort of halcyon age where England ruled the waves and did all sorts of things with a powerful country and could call the shots, and that sort of mid-Atlantic idea of the UK would be some sort of Singapore of the mid-Atlantic, which is still talked about by Brexiteers. It seems to look backwards rather than forwards. Modern Scottish independence campaigners are looking forward. I mean, we're looking to a social democratic society. We want more equality, we want environmental responsibility, we want an independent parliament which expresses that. We want to stop the interference of Westminster, which makes it extremely difficult to progress these social and economic aims in Scotland. And we want a relationship with the rest of Europe and the world. We want to one of the great founders of modern Scottish nationalism was the redoubtable, still alive, but still well, Winnie Ewing. Madame de Coste, as she was called in the European Parliament. When she left the European Parliament, she was the oldest member in terms of seniority in the European Parliament. And Winnie Ewing had a great phrase in her early career, which she said, "Stop the world, Scotland wants to get on." So, if you like, I would say the contrast between the Brexiteers is that there are people who think, stop the world, the UK wants to get off. Whereas Scottish nationalism, Scottish independence campaigners are stop the world, Scotland wants to get on. So it's an inclusive rather than exclusive exposition of the case for independence. And on the, should we be grateful to the Brexiteers? Well, as I said, the fishermen of Scotland, the business people of Scotland, the workers of Scotland, the people whose livelihoods depend on European trade and commerce, they're not grateful to the Brexiteers. And in terms of the case for independence, although it has exemplified why Scotland needs to be independent, there's no doubt about that, it does place our economy and our society in great jeopardy. So it shows the urgency by which the case must be pursued, certainly. But if you'd asked me to choose, I'd rather have been choosing arguing the case for independence within the context of the European Union than being outside with the Brexiteers. It shows the urgency of our cause, but it's at a great cost to Scottish society and to Scottish workers, and that's to be regretted.
Thank you. Gosh, we've run over 17 minutes, and I have to say, Alex, I hope that you're pleased with the over 60 people who stayed on despite PMQs. Thank you so much for giving us your time, and I know you have some follow-up interviews this afternoon, and we hope to see you again at the FPA soon. It was great to see you today.
Right, can I thank President Kate and yourself, Deborah, for your courtesy as ever. I've greatly enjoyed these sessions, as I always do. And of course, anytime you wish to invite me, I shall be back here at the Foreign Press Association, and hopefully in times to come, it won't just be virtually. It'll be back in a full press conference format when the world is restored to its axis, which we all hope will be very soon. But thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
I'll send a recording round as usual. Bye.